All right. I got your attention, didn't I? I didn't even have to sing. Bonjour, kwe kakina, diativ, or giatoif, choif. Bonjour, welcome everybody. If you want to make your way, find a seat. We will apparently be, Dónall, if you were lucky enough to see his last presentation, I don't think we got a break. It was 5 hours solid of working hard. But apparently today we get a break, so we'll be able to go and sample some of those yummies just shortly. Welcome to Heritage Hall in Low Quebec. We're here on unceded, unsurrendered land of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people who've been here for since time immemorial. They've taken care of this land and these waterways in ways that are sacred and precious, and we could only hope that we would be able to honor these lands and this water in this way. So we're really grateful that we're able to be here. Today's presentation, we're going to be talking about the loss and the decline of Irish, the Irish language that used to be really prevalent here. And it makes me wonder about the indigenous languages that were prevalent all across Turtle Island and all around the world that have all but disappeared. So a land acknowledgement is but words that can fall really shallow and really hollow unless they're followed by action. And so my hope is that together we'll be able to work towards real, true reconciliation, steps to improve all of our lives. Thank you for your attention on that, miigwech. So, just for today's presentation, I want to let you know, first of all, if you have one of those electronic phones, if you can set it in a mode that it won't interfere with your neighbors, that would be great. Yes, reminding the presenter. I had a voicemail during one of my presentations many years ago. It was embarrassing after telling everyone to turn their phones off. The washrooms are just around here to the right, and I think that's all of the housekeeping duties for the building. So we're in Heritage Hall. Is Don Keeley here today? I don't think I've seen him. Well, he's writing a book about the history of the building of Heritage Hall, which was completely built by volunteers back in the day when you were mostly allowed to do such things, although they kind of did it en cachette. So you can look forward to that book coming in the near future. Just blabbing here, and oh yes, if you're not a member of the Historical Society yet, raise your hands. If you're not, you don't have to actually admit if you're not. But if you would care to join the Gatineau Valley Historical Society, we have a membership table over here. Dave, wave so we know who you are. And he's also selling all these other books. So it's $25 a year, and we get to put on presentations like this and maintain some really important archives, which without these funds, we wouldn't be able to do that. So we would be losing history. It's $40 for 2 years. That's a better deal, just not that I'm trying to push it. And I know our presenter, Dónall O'Doul, has a book over there for sale as well, which I don't know anything about the book. I'm sure he'll tell us about it. But before we get to that, I think that was all of the housekeeping duties and such that I had. It took us a few minutes just to get all of the technology. It used to be so simple when you'd come and do a presentation, you'd just good afternoon, everybody. And now we have to make sure that everything is talking to everything. And I think Pete has got a handle on that. Thanks, Pete, very much for all that time. So you didn't come here to listen to me blather on. Well, some of you did. My husband probably did. But I'm going to ask Gilbert White Duck to come up here in a minute and introduce our presenter. So Gilbert, I'm sure many of you know Gilbert. He's president of the Gatineau Valley Historical Society, and he was former chief of the Kitigan-Zibi First Nation and a band counselor for many years. And here's Don Keeley. I made a big you missed it. I flogged your book, your upcoming book. So Gilbert, of course, he's got his hands into so many pies. We're really lucky that he has taken on the Historical Society for yet another term. So welcome to Gilbert. Oh, you don't need that. I forgot.
Miigwech for those words. Gilbert Waigdak and Nijikas Kitigan Zibini Nonjaba Pijashig. I welcome you in Algonquin, Pijashig meaning welcome, welcome to this territory, to this land. And I bring greetings, obviously, from the Algonquins to the extent that I can. That's very important. And, you know, being part of the Historical Society has given me the opportunity to raise issues related to the Algonquin Anishinaabe so that people living in the region better understand how we came to be into this territory and have continued to occupy and use this land in the best way that we have. And of course, the topic in regards to our connection to the Irish that came is really always very intriguing to me, because the early Indian agents were Irish, and anyhow, I don't want to get into that story. That would be a presentation of its own on my part from our perspective, you know. But they played a very important role and impacted the community in many ways from way back when our community was created in 1853, pre-Confederation community, which was not one selected by the government, but one that our traditional chief, who came out of Lake of Two Mountains, decided that he wanted a piece of land because the settlers were taking everything, and he wanted to have something that the people living on the land could go to, because we were being pushed off all over. So we ended up, in a way, on what's now called an Indian reservation with all the limitations. But I am not here, I am not the speaker, so So Dónall O'Doul is a Celtic studies scholar and educator who has taught the Irish language across Canada for 20 years. His 2015 peer-reviewed book, Mila Mila Igain, The Irish Language in Canada, was the first monograph dedicated to the subject, followed by The Gaels in the Land Too Cold, which formed the basis of a virtual museum exhibit showcasing over 100 Irish language compositions from Canada and related artifacts, the first collection of its kind. He is the elected head of North America's Irish-speaking community and is raising his two daughters with Irish as their first language. Beyond language advocacy, Dónall holds a degree in Egyptology and Masters of Arts Conservation with a focus on the ethical treatment of human remains, a great interest of mine. Also, having worked to preserve ancient human remains in Abydos, Egypt. He is an archaeological conservator with Parks Canada, preserving heritage from across Canada and national parks and historical sites. I welcome Dónall to this. I am sure will be a very interesting second presentation. Miigwech.
All right, well, Madden Bradiv, Trahon Lava Beder, Agus Guramira Mahaka Vivayan Ardante Nov. Thanks everybody for being here today. I'll do my best to go through this and give everybody time for a nice little break in the middle. I haven't really planned that, so it's just whenever it feels right. I see people shuffling, we'll go and we'll get some tea or something. Our talk today is going to be specifically about the people who came speaking the Irish language. Now, we know that there's a history of that. We experienced that at our workshop, that not all Irish speak the Irish language. There are colonial reasons for that. And we'll be looking at this beautiful area and what is really, I think, from an Irish speaker's perspective, something that's really unique, almost globally for this area, something you should be really proud of in this area. So we have done the land acknowledgement. I do want to also bring to attention that we are on the unceded ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe, specifically Kitigan-Zibi. The story that I'm going to share is, as I said, about an Dubhghaill. I'm terrible at self-promotion. There is a book. It's $20. If this shines to you, it's mostly gathering together the various sources. Until I wrote the book, I had been told, going through the university system, that the Irish language was never here. Anybody who left Ireland wouldn't have spoken it. The earlier settlers were mostly Protestant. The ones who came, they would have, within some confusion, but they would have spoken in English upon arrival. And the difficulty in my mind going through my education was my Irish language classes saying that upon their departure from Ireland, the vast majority of these people only spoke the Irish language. So there was falling into the cracks between these two narratives, where somewhere in the Atlantic there is a magical point where all the people on the immigrant ships stopped speaking Irish and started speaking English or French. And so this has become kind of, you can see I've got my hand in a whole lot of different jobs here all across the country. This is my life. I have work on the side, and the Irish language is me. This is my soul speaking here. So we're going to go through this today. I do have, for anyone who's interested, I am the head of a nonprofit. We have the community of Irish speakers here, which is really special. It's the only kind of officially endorsed Irish language area outside of Ireland itself, and that's just outside of Kingston. So we have a nonprofit for that. We run courses, we run immersion through that. I did also put on the table just some little pamphlets about discovering Irish, and if you want to try a couple phrases, some phonetics. Anybody who wanted to try it probably came to the other workshop and left being fluent speakers. So we'll hear some Irish today, and we'll experience what this language was here in the Valley. Let me start my timer so I know where we are. There we are. All right. So the Irish language in Gaeilge, for me, an Gaeilin, it's a story about survival for a time here in the Gatineau Valley. This language had been spoken for thousands of years in Ireland. It continues to be spoken, but as we saw, it is spoken by around 1% of the population as their daily language. It was carried across the Atlantic by people who had lost nearly everything except for their words. So it's often assumed that the Irish disappeared swiftly, as I said, and entirely from the mouths and minds of speakers upon arrival, neatly replaced by either English or French, filling in that cultural gap in their minds. But evidence from the Gatineau Valley suggests a much more complex and compelling history, one in which the Irish language not only survived, but adapted to new environments, crossing boundaries of religion, identity, and nationhood. But it's also a story that sits within the wider history of colonialism, displacement, and cultural survival. The Irish experienced dispossession, being silenced and made strangers in their own lands. But as settlers, they came to Canada as part of a colonial process that dispossessed the Indigenous people of this land. Their arrival cannot be separated from that history. I will touch on that in this presentation. That's not necessarily the focus of this presentation because I'm not telling the broad story of the Irish in Canada. I'm telling the story of the Irish language in Canada. I share the story not to draw equivalences, but to contribute, however humbly, to a broader conversation about language reclamation, cultural sovereignty, and healing, and what it means to carry a language not just as a means of speech, but as a way of remembering. But in the Irish fashion, anyone who's at my workshop will know, I like my stories, I like my songs. We're going to start off with a story. These are just some beautiful images from the west of Ireland to kind of set the scene of English can't really explain what's happening in these images. These are Gaelic images. I have one of those hat tea myself that I wear with my daughters. They think it's great. All right. In the days before the world was as we know it, the Tuatha De Danann lived in Ireland, a people of great beauty and power who walked the land in harmony with the wind, the stone, the tree, and the tide. These were our old gods. Among them was Lear, the Lord of the Water, who loved his children more than life itself. Fionnuala, the eldest, almost my daughter's name, but then she came out with black hair, not blonde, so we had to change her name at the last minute. The eldest, wise and strong of heart, his proud and golden boy, and the twins Fiachra and Con, light-footed and full of laughter. Their mother, Lear's first wife, had died young, and though grief hung over the household like a morning mist, it was always scattered by the joy of the children's voices and their closeness with their father. He built them a home beside Loch Darvadach, and the waters there were calm, mirroring the peace within them. But peace in such stories is often a fragile thing. The king of the Tuatha De Danann, Boderig, sent Lear a new wife, the sister of his first love, Aoife. Aoife came adorned with beauty and grace, and at first she was kind to the children. But in time, the joy they shared began to wound her. She watched how Lear's eyes softened only for them, how the halls rang with their songs, while she remained outside the circle of their bond, and so, where love could not reach her, envy did. It hollowed out her heart. And one day, as the sun bent low over the reeds, Aoife took the children in her chariot, saying that they would visit their grandfather, Bull. But beside the still waters of Loch Darvadach, she stepped down and, drawing from her druidic magic, struck them with a spell. Their human forms fell away, and where 4 children had stood before, there were now but 4 white swans, their necks arched and trembling, their eyes still full of understanding. The curse was cruelly measured. 300 years they would spend on Loch Darvadach, 300 more on the Straits of Moyle, the sea between the coasts of Ulster and Scotland, and 300 on the waters of the Western Sea off Achill Island in Mayo. Never in those 900 years were they to feel the grass under their feet. Their voices Aoife did not take. That perhaps was her one final mercy or her one final cruelty. For though they sang as they flew into exile, songs of beauty, sorrow, and memory, they could never go home. For 300 years they survived on the lake of their home, and there they saw the world slowly changing. When at last their father died, their crying and lamenting was heard throughout the country. Eventually Lear's hall grew quiet, stone fell into ruin, only the swans endured. The following 300 years, they were tormented by the harsh, salty sea of Moyle. They heard the cry of the wolves from distant shores and the crack of the ice forming on the waves. They clung to one another in storm and silence, their feathers torn by hail, their song worn down to a thread of memory. Fionnuala wrapped her wings around her brothers to keep them from despair, placing one brother under her breast and one under each wing. The 3 final 100 years were the most cruel of all, with winter sea swells that almost overcame them. Clinging to the few craggy spots of refuge that they could find was a bitter irony as the skin of their legs froze to the stone, and only through great suffering and pain could they move, exposed blood and muscle splashed with the salt water of both the ocean and their own tears. Though through the centuries they wandered, driven by cold winds and cruel tides. At last, when their 900 years had passed, the spell was broken and they had their freedom to fly home, but time had moved on. And the land had changed. The Tuatha De Danann, their father, and everyone that they knew had faded from memory. Their own suffering, and even who they originally had been forgotten. Seeking refuge, they came to Inishglóide. There they were taken in by a holy man, singing in his small church the voice of the swans, and their enduring ancient threads of music tinged with loss and sadness brought listeners from afar. They lived for a while in a new peace, saddened by their history but hopeful for their future. However, the new king heard the tales of the swans who sang with human voices. Rather than listen to their story with kindness and understanding, the king saw them only as possessions, something he jealously wanted to own for himself. When his hand landed on these poor souls, their feathers and down dropped from their bodies, and where a moment before there had been 4 white swans, there were now 3 greyed, emaciated old men and an ancient, parchment-thin woman, bare, without blood in her, without meat upon her. They thanked the saint for his kindness, friendship, and understanding, one of the few truly kind people they had encountered in their long lives. And together, with the weight of the 900 years of suffering upon them, their voices were finally silenced and the 4 died, taking the songs, stories, and memories of their old world with them. They were placed down into one single grave, with one brother under Fionnuala's breast and a brother under each arm, their faces turned towards the sea. Now, their story is not one of return, the children of Lear, but of remembering. They carried their home with them in their songs and in their words, even as the world forgot its shape. This story, with all its ache and endurance, followed the Irish across the sea. As we will see, it lived on in the hearts of those who left famine-shadowed countries for distant woods and rivers, including those who settled here in the Gatineau Valley. Today, we gather to listen to that echo, to the voices that crossed an ocean, and to what they carried with them. In the old story, the swans kept singing, even in the coldest waters, and it is that song that we are going to hear today. The Gatineau Valley has always been home to the Anishinaabe people, who traditionally moved with the seasons through the forests and along the rivers of the territory, stretching from Lake Superior to Quebec City, James Bay to the US border. Territorial areas were distinct and recognized and respected and provided enough to sustain the families that were living upon them. In a highly complex relationship, they maintained the land with care and reciprocity for generations. As I said, this will not be the focus of my talk. I am not an expert to be able to talk about such an object. The way I'm telling this story is obviously going to lean into the Irish role, specifically the Irish-speaking role in the Valley. But 2 fabulous books that I would recommend concerning Kitigan-Zibi and the culture of the first people of these lands are Kirby White Duck's Algonquin Traditional Culture. Up until this point of him writing this fabulous volume, in my opinion, there hadn't been a collection of the very vast number of sources concerning the beautiful culture of these peoples, as well as Stephen McGregor's Since Time Immemorial, which is not only the story of Kitigan-Zibi, but also a view of the history up to the present of these lands that we call Canada, including topics such as World War I through a specifically Anishinaabe view. So I would highly recommend both of these if you are interested. European presence in the Gatineau region then began around 1760, initially through the fur trade, and though officially discouraged at the start, settlement followed soon after, spurred by settler colonial expansion and a government with little interest in enforcing Indigenous land rights. In 1800, Anglo-American Philemon Wright arrived from Massachusetts with a group of settlers, claiming the land where the Gatineau and Ottawa rivers meet. Hull was established, and with it came the rapid deforestation of ancestral lands and the transformation of the landscape into a supplier of timber and agriculture for English and Quebec markets. Colonial expansion proceeded as though the lands were empty, though they never have been. Wright himself was acutely aware that he was taking the means of sustenance from others, recording in his 1823 report 2 chiefs who met with him to protest his cutting of sugar maples and who disputed his declared claim on the lands of Gatineau. Despite his aid to the British in the conquest of Quebec, Chief Constant Penency watched as his people were devastated by disease and their lands taken. Penency sent over 20 separate petitions to stop the illegal seizure of the territory, all of which went ignored. Some suggest that he may actually have been one of the 2 chiefs who met with Wright on that day. By the 1830s, a powerful clique of lumber barons dominated the region, forming an exclusive privilege to suppress small operators and reshaping the economy around the needs of the timber trade. Their names are still placed over the landscape. Wright, John Egan of Egansville, who we are going to meet today, and Andrew Lemmy of Lac Lemmy. Land cleared of trees was offered as farmland to support the ever-growing lumber camps. The industry needed labor, and into that need stepped a group considered marginal, expendable, and desperate, the Irish. In a letter written to Darcy McGee, Thomas Darcy McGee, the prejudice that the Irish arrived to was put quite bluntly. This is a direct quote. "Their slavish principles made them our serfs in Ireland, and it will make them here in Canada the hewers of our wood and the drawers of our water. Freedom is the gift of heaven. The Irish are the children of hell, and therefore they cannot have their freedom." This was the climate into which the tenant farmer Irish arrived, unwanted by some, exploited by others, yet desperately seeking survival and the possibility of something better than the perpetual discrimination that they faced in Ireland. The Irish who came to Quebec in the early 19th century didn't leave Ireland. They were pushed out. In the wake of centuries of colonization, the penal laws had stripped the Catholics of land, education, and political power. Sectarian fighting had devastated the country. The Gaelic Irish were not just poor, but systemically marginalized. Their language and culture were deemed backward, a Stone Age leftover, as you can see in the quote on, I believe, the right-hand side there. Something to be eradicated, as it had not been properly outcompeted in, what do they say, had not, according to the laws of nature, made way for the superior races. Their very presence in Ireland was considered to be a problem that needed to be solved. They boarded timber ships returning to Canada from Britain. Now empty of lumber, the ships used passengers under subsidized fares as cheap ballast for the return journey. The first large wave of Irish emigrants to Canada, Protestant farmers, mainly from Wicklow and Wexford, arrived in the 1820s. This region in Ireland had witnessed terrible scenes of bloody suppression during the Irish Rebellion of 1798, with people fleeing as a result. Others arriving in the Gatineau Valley were Catholic tenant farmers, landless and vulnerable, hoping to find in Canada what was denied to them at home: land, autonomy, and survival. They came from across Ireland, from Galway, Mayo, Clare, Kilkenny, Armagh, and brought with them a patchwork of dialects and traditions and beliefs. It's around these earlier Irish arrivals that Irish-speaking settlements formed, as we'll see, such as Chelsea or Mayo, Quebec. These earliest Irish were soon joined by a tidal wave of trauma during the Great Famine. The residents of Mayo, Quebec had arrived in Canada from Mayo, Ireland, in the decade just prior to the famine. This is Ilan Acla, Achill Island. We heard that from the story of the swans. This is before the famine. Any later than that, and they might not have arrived at all. As when the famine did strike, around 30% of the population of Mayo, Ireland, was lost. This is still, you can go and visit this on Achill Island. One of my friends is from Achill Island. This is the deserted village, where it's recorded in one census that it was inhabited by about 300 people. And after the famine, when they came to check again, this is what they found, were empty houses. But we're going to hear more about that in the moment. We'll be skipping a little back and forth through time. So let's look briefly at one of these early arrivals. John Egan was born in 1811 in the west of Ireland, in Lissavichone, County Galway, deep within the heart of the Irish-speaking province of Connacht. He grew up in a land where the native language was widely spoken, and English almost unknown by the peasantry, but where colonial rule had long since stripped Irish of any institutional power. Egan's family were poor Catholic tenant farmers, Gaels living under the weight of a colonial authority that sought not only to rule them, but also to erase their language and culture from existence, claiming that this was for their betterment. The English landlords who controlled the land had by then engineered a political and economic system designed to suppress the Gaelic Irish at every level possible. The penal laws had excluded Catholics from the land, ownership, education, and any positions of power. If we remember my workshop where we did the poem of the man being shot for the value of a 5-pound horse, that was due to the penal laws, that Catholics could not own a horse over 5 pounds. In Egan's youth, Daniel O'Connell's mass movement for Catholic emancipation gave rise to renewed hope, but also provoked violent retaliation from the Orange Order. Protestants aligned with the English colonial establishment mobilized to crush the growing calls for equality. Egan would have known intimately how language, land, and identity are bound together, and how each was threatened by a system that sought to erase the Gaelic Irish from their own history. At 20, Egan left Ireland. Like so many Irish, he crossed the Atlantic not as a dreamer, but as a dispossessed and desperate man. He arrived in Bytown in the 1830s, penniless and with little formal education. Canada has been called the future that Ireland never had, and this proved true for Egan. Free from his inherited poverty in Ireland, Egan was able to set up a dry goods store in Aylmer, and he soon entered the burgeoning lumber trade. In time, he would become one of the most powerful industrialists in the Ottawa Valley, for better or for worse. By the early 1850s, Egan's timber company employed nearly 4,000 men across more than 100 lumber camps. Egan specifically recruited and employed Irish immigrants, many of whom had fled Ireland in the wake of the famine and systemic poverty. These workers, often illiterate, speaking only Irish, were welcomed by Egan. He advertised in ports of Cork and Dónall specifically, offering affordable passages across the Atlantic and selling land in the Ottawa Valley at 50 cents an acre, often letting the payment wait for years. When John Egan died of cholera in 1857, aged just 46, he had already transformed the economic and demographic landscape of the Ottawa and Gatineau Valleys. Thousands of Irish-speaking families owed their stability and in many cases their very survival to him. Egan's legacy is obviously complex and was not limited to the Irish. While many in the timber trade viewed the Anishinaabe communities along the Gatineau and Ottawa rivers as obstacles to further economic gain, Egan supported efforts to secure land for what is now Kitigan-Zibi, at least in my humble understanding of the situation, presenting a petition into Parliament on behalf of the Anishinaabe in 1849. This obviously did not undo the broader legacy of settler colonialism, nor erase the fact that Egan's wealth was specifically built on the exploitation of these people's unceded territory. But maybe I like to think that through his own people's experiences, that he could recognize that what was happening was unjust. In another world, one where Ireland had been allowed to thrive on its own terms, John Egan could have prospered in his own land. Eamon McKee has noted that there is a general amnesia about the Irish lumber barons, such as Egan, in Canadian history. And one reason for that is that they simply didn't fit the stereotype of the Irish as low intelligence, brute labor, requiring the enlightened English colonial rule of British authorities that was perpetuated at the time. This is from Library and Archives Canada. It is the first cabin in the Ireland settlement of Grenville, Quebec. You can see how it very much is trying to replicate that very treeless Mayo landscape, whether that is appropriate for Canada or not. Between 1845 and 1852, Ireland was plunged into catastrophe. The Great Famine on Dubhghaill was not simply the result of a crop failure, it was a catastrophic failure of governance and humanity, in which a colonial state chose the value of the free market over the value of life. The potato blight decimated the staple food of the rural poor, but the land continued to produce grain, beef, and butter, exports that were all shipped abroad, even as people starved. The British response was slow, inadequate, and laced with contempt. In 1846, Sir Charles Edward Trevelyan, the English official in charge of famine relief in Ireland, declared that the famine was a mechanism for, this is again a direct quote, mechanism for reducing the surplus population. The judgment of God sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson. That calamity must not be too much mitigated. That year, as the famine worsened, he decided to entirely dismantle the relief scheme. The famine struck hardest in the Gaelic West, Mayo, Connemara, Dónall, Kerry, places already under economic siege and overwhelmingly Irish-speaking. Entire communities vanished. The poorest were evicted, buried in mass graves, or lost to the sea in coffin ships. Lord Lansdowne, the Governor-General of Canada at the time, is one example of the violence of those years. He cleared his own 95,000-acre estate in County Kerry of all of its tenants, leading to the New York poorhouse being nicknamed Lansdowne's Castle. These were not isolated misfortunes, but symptoms of a system that treated the Irish peasantry as disposable and unwanted within the British imperial economy, with many declaring the loss of Gaelic life to be a net positive for both Ireland and the British Empire. We can have a direct quote from the Cork Examiner newspaper. Most of the British newspapers at the time didn't give direct examples of what was happening in Ireland. The Cork Examiner, being an Irish-based newspaper, is a little more visceral. Disease and death in every quarter, a once hardy population worn away to emaciated skeletons, fever, dropsy, diarrhea, and famine rioting in every filthy hovel and sweeping away whole families. Hundreds frantically rushing from their home and country, not with the idea of making fortunes in other lands, but to fly from a scene of suffering and death. 75 tenants ejected here, a whole village in the last stage of destitution there. Dead bodies of children flung into holes, hastily scratched in the earth without shroud or coffin. Wives traveling 10 miles to beg the charity of a coffin for a dead husband and bearing it back that weary distance. Every field becoming a grave and the land a wilderness. As the famine deepened, hundreds of thousands fled the country. Those arriving on Canadian shores were not immigrants in search of adventure. They were refugees, starving, diseased, around 2/3 of them speaking only the Irish language at this point. The journey for them was often fatal. Typhus and cholera spread quickly in the overcrowded holes, and those who survived disembarked in Quebec City and Montreal alone and with no possessions. There was actually a protest by the government of St. John, New Brunswick against the landholder in, I believe, Mayo, I could be mistaken there, that before he had sent them on the ships that he had confiscated their property, including their clothing, and so they arrived mostly naked to the Canadian winter. They arrived in many cases alone to go through a quarantine station for the public health and safety of the Canadian population. In Quebec City, perhaps Montreal, Partridge Island and St. John, New Brunswick is normally overlooked, but that was a strong port as well, before making their way inland, up the Ottawa River, towards the woods and rivers of the Gatineau, seeking work, land, and a tenuous hope for stability in the shadow of this staggering loss to them. Ruth Dunnigan of Mayo, Quebec, recounted to Michael McBain when he was collecting oral histories, "My mother told me that her father and mother came over on the boat with hundreds of others, and she had 2 boys, and I think she had 3 girls. And one girl was sick before they left Ireland, the 3-year-old, and she left her with a relative over there, and they never saw her afterwards. And her younger son was a year old, and she took it with her naturally, but it died within a day of reaching Quebec City. And so she held it in secret. You know how they used to turn up their skirts over their shoulders. The old ladies had long skirts and a long underskirt. And if they got cold, they turned up the skirt over their shoulder. Well, she kept the baby there, the dead baby, a while, because she didn't want it to be buried at sea. It was buried in Quebec someplace. Her name was Rogers, Catherine Rogers. It took them 6 weeks, and they were all sick on the boat. Everything was taken from them." There's much I could also say about those boat operators, but then our talk would stretch innumerably out. They were known for pouring out the water supplies so that then the Irish immigrants could only buy alcohol from them, as well as giving them a small portion of rice that they didn't have water then to cook the rice in, and so most people got violently ill from eating uncooked rice. Very few people ever saw any repercussions from the authorities for that. In Ireland, these people had faced inherited marginalization, living under abject poverty and cultural suppression for generations. This mass of Irish-speaking Irish arrived with almost nothing except their language, memory, and a will to survive. In Canada, they had a chance to improve their position, but this came at the expense of the further marginalization of the land's Indigenous inhabitants. Among those who made the long journey from famine-stricken Ireland to the forests of the Gatineau was Catherine Holmes. Born around 1830 in Dubhghaill, County Mayo. There's a lot of Mayo in our talk today. Dubhghaill, County Mayo, a village scarred by one of the famine's most haunting tragedies. During the worst years of starvation, residents were ordered to walk 19 kilometers through storm and cold to be inspected by government officials at the landlord's private hunting lodge, because the officials didn't want to be out in the bad weather. These people needed to march from their village, Dubhghaill, where Catherine Holmes was from, so that they could be inspected. The officials wanted to make sure that there were quantifiable signs of starvation and that people weren't just cheating the system for food. Many of these people never made it. Many perished on the way, never returning home. The exact count is heavily disputed. We simply don't know. It's likely that Catherine knew some of those people that were lost. This village was about 100 people. Perhaps she even lost relatives herself that day. Though they had attempted to flee such treatment, Catherine's immediate family fared no better. Her husband and her 2 young children all died on the voyage, leaving her alone in the world. After being processed at the quarantine station in Kingston, Ontario, Catherine made her way to Ottawa, walking 150 kilometers on foot, before finally settling in the Gatineau Valley in Wilson's Corners. I should also mention that the Dubhghaill tragedy, as they call it, the forced march of these people over 19 kilometers, is something that is connected to the Choctaw community and their donation. The Indigenous communities of Montreal also made a very generous donation to the Irish during the famine that goes mostly unrecognized in the larger history. The Choctaw Nation commemorates specifically this event and its connection through their famine donations when they had only recently experienced the Trail of Tears themselves to have sent $500 American over to the Irish famine relief, meaning that there are now people who come to the commemorations and learn Choctaw from Ireland, and there are members of the Choctaw Nation who are invited across to Ireland to be able to learn the Irish language to make this walk around the lake as well. Catherine Holmes remarried, and she raised 9 children with her new husband, William Holmes. Her descendants recall that she continued to speak Irish with other immigrant women in the community throughout her life. In a world where the language had been blamed for poverty, mocked by the powerful, and erased from the official record, Catherine Holmes kept speaking. I have some clips from the 1901 census that are a little hard to make out, only because it was written a very long time ago, but we can see her beautiful name up on there, quite misspelt, as well as her being born in Ireland around 1868, or 18 something. And I have it on the previous slide, excuse me. 1830, there we go. And her mother tongue, if still spoken, being the Irish language, as well as an image of Dubhghaill, so you can see where she came from. Very reminiscent of the Gatineau Valley hills. Thomas O'Boyle, Father Thomas O'Boyle, as he was known in English, he continued to write with his Irish name throughout his life, is one of the most striking examples of the Irish language continuity in this region. He was born himself, again, County Mayo. If anyone wants to learn Irish, probably learn Mayo Irish if you want to be accurate to what was spoken here at one point. Born in Mayo around 1820, O'Boyle was educated at the College of Tuam and later in Paris. He was ordained in 1848 and almost immediately sent to Upper Wakefield, now Ferrelton, to minister to a struggling Irish-speaking population. He served there until 1854, but O'Boyle was not only a clergyman, he was a poet, a cultural naturalist, and a scholar of classical Irish verse. In this point in history, some of the only people who were literate in the Irish language were priests who had left Ireland to be educated on the continent because there was not the prohibition against learning Irish at that point for them. He published under the name Éire go Brá, Ireland Eternally, and exchanged letters with figures like Sean O'Dónall of the Ossianic Society in Dublin, even setting transcriptions of the ancient Ogham stone inscriptions. If you remember from my workshop, that's our old writing system with just lines and dots. Him working from his cabin here to send across translations of Ogham stones. What a mad, wonderful person. Sean O'Dónall did comment that had he survived later in life, he probably, and had a different station in life, probably would have been one of the most leading figures within the Irish language revival that was occurring at that point. Even in the forests of Quebec and Ontario, Dubhghaill remained part of a broader literary network devoted to the Irish language and its preservation. And he published poetry, which is what brought me into speaking to everybody the first time and continues to draw me back to the Valley, being that he knew how to read and write in Irish. The majority of people who came, unfortunately, left no evidence of themselves in the written language. His poetry is a window into the emotional world of the Irish exile. In his poem, which most people ascribe to him, but he flatly said he collected from another immigrant that had a tune that went with it. Unfortunately, he didn't transcribe the tune. I have no idea what that might have been. It would be lovely to sing. A Gaelic vín Gaelish, oh gentle sweet Gaelic. Collected by him, as I said, after he moved to Enniskerry, Ontario. Irish in this poem is imagined not as a fading relic of a past world, but as a living force waiting to rise up again. The language is cast as both a spiritual heirloom and a political hope for the Irish people. What is this poem? Mar neb hasha umlawn fe códach na miljerk, da fós ar níl Gaelic gan ville gan ve. A fehi ver hirschen na heren le bioshark, go nairoi go nua chan, le reim agus ra. In oort no na kille, ve rua vín na tlé, da anam na Gaelige, shir ri ag shir os, da kloitse gné folle, mar tá larmach lé, níl dúg Gaelige éiren foil bridde na báis. As an unharmed saintly relic, protected in its reliquary, still our loyal Gaelic is without destruction, without decline, waiting hopefully for the freedom of Ireland with lively affection, until it will arise anew and ancient with authority and prosperity in the fresh complexion of the woods. Under the red peak of the mountain is the soul of Gaelic ever flowing, ever growing, as are the people of Ireland, as is my heart, the heart in my breast. Nach crua, didn't read the rest of my... It is not fated for the Gaelic of Ireland to get only misery and death. I have to scroll down. This vision of Irish, not as a language of the past, but as a living and resilient force, makes it clear that the poet, whoever that may have been in this area, believed that Irish could not only survive, but flourish in this modern world. In another poem, An Dóirí as Éireann, the exile from Ireland in 1857, Dubhghaill expressed the spiritual and physical dislocation of the emigrant. This is especially poignant as Dubhghaill would have witnessed firsthand the arrival of the beleaguered, mostly Irish-speaking famine refugees, which by 1851 accounted for half the residents of Wakefield, Low and Masham. Nach crua voeren dori go kroitse muglúshocht. Vergilte te foske is eg feil is eg fie. A chaimse gan diede no gorte na rooshocht. Nil aris na doges in ondom nis schie. Foareer, vis na kluinte glasgreach, toeskoffer. Shan aris ma hintjes ni chonoed go bover. Eg gleas ma chien klaarsie, le koerocht vog vlaver. Na sjole a tedrige Éireann go bra. Isn't it harsh, bellowed the exile bitterly. My journey in the woods, where are the shadowy forms of wolves and deer. I am without shelter from famine and its horrors. There is no home or native land destined for me any longer. Alas, about the green-branched meadows, thick and dreadful, the old home of my ancestors, I will not reside in comfort. Playing my gentle harp with soft flowing fragrance, its strings calling out to Ireland forever. Such poems underscore the deep emotional ties between language, identity, and homeland, even as Irish speakers made new lives in a Canadian context. These poems are more than literary artifacts. They are acts of defiance, the voice of the Gael singing back from the margins of history. How did I come across these pieces? They're not in books. As we will see, Dubhghaill and the next person I'm going to talk about, William Dónall, both had to send their poems away. They sent them down to America. There was no facilities for printing the Irish language in Canada. And because of that, they fell through the gaps. Irish American scholars didn't really recognize them because they weren't from America. Scholars in Ireland didn't really recognize them because they were concerned about the language survival in Ireland. And the overriding story was that the language never existed in Canada, so who would ever think to look? The first poem that we experienced there, a Gaelic Vein Véilish. For that one, I had to go down to the library in New York State to find the single roll of microfilm on which an old copy of the newspaper luckily had been scanned and still exists, and make a copy of it for myself. Dubhghaill decided, I don't know at what level he was educated within his own language, but he created his own orthography. So all of the spellings are all over the place. So modernizing that so that it can be comprehensible to a modern speaker of Irish and bringing these pieces back to life has been something that's very rewarding, bringing them to prominence from something that was that close to being entirely lost and us not even knowing that his poetry existed. If anyone is interested, Dubhghaill is buried in Enniskerry, Ontario. His grave is there. You can go and visit him. I tend to go and visit him quite frequently and read his poetry to him. All right, where are we? Where did my little mouse go? There we are. Dubhghaill published his poems after leaving Wakefield, but they speak to the level of Irish that was once present in this valley. He died in 1866 at the age of 46. Like John Egan, a life brief but deeply affecting, and carried the moniker the friend of the orphan and the widow was what he was called by the population in Enniskerry. His poetry, his pastoral work, and his scholarly correspondence make him one of the most vivid reminders that Irish, for many in the Gatineau Valley who arrived, was not a language that they left behind them in Ireland, but one that they carried with them in their hearts and in their minds across oceans and forests. And I think he and I would have got on like a house on fire. Someone else that I'd like to mention today, William Dónall. He was born in County Clare, around the year 1819. William Dónall, that's not a real picture of him. I just created a picture of him because I needed some visual. William Dónall relocated to the Ottawa Valley, where he married up in Perth, before settling in Buckingham, Quebec. One of William's poems from Buckingham survives for us, only a single one, and that's how we know that he was a poet, titled Maudlin le Fádrig, St. Patrick's Morn. Now, this one I'm not going to throw up on the screen. It has a very, very violent and bloody Fenian nature to it. It is a strong call to rise up against the English hegemony, including the emotions felt in the poetry. It includes the emotions felt in the poetry of Tomás Dubhghaill, but with a much more militant leaning. So I'll give you a tasting of his work. Ke fada ha gailif ag galif o dreacha. How long are the Gaels by the foreigners distressed, causing their brutal hardship being grinded weak? Glaki gurnarum is dergi gdiltis, de yena akama le kalig a chlig shiv. Take up your arms and claim your vengeance, to be done upon that tribe that conquered you by treachery. Nish sedig o yersmacht a resachsen na Dónnig, a gasre Gaelach, dir na honora, no titig treachte le creache na glore, nor seir madden le fodrig. Now make free from the enslavement of England of the asses, O young Gaels of the true strength of honour, or fall exhausted in glorious ruination as free men upon St. Patrick's Day morning. So as I mentioned, just like Father O'Boyle, there wasn't a place to publish these type of poems in Canada. How many poems did we lose for not having a place to publish them? How many poems were lost because the people who composed them could not read or write, and they lived with the language? He sent it down to the New York-based Irish American newspaper, and I would imagine that due to the strong Leafetian tone, even if we did have publishing facilities in Canada, it probably would not have been published here. Regrettably, this poem would then be the last published by the newspaper before its Gaelic department was shuttered, shortly after St. Patrick's Day in 1863, not due to lack of readership, but due to lack of editorial support. All right. We're going to dip into census studies. I'm going to take a break before census studies because I want everybody to be nice and awake and alert for a census study. But we'll do one little slide here and get up and stretch after that. By the end of the 19th century, if anybody is interested in this map only exists in this presentation. I made this for this presentation. If you want a picture of it, I'll leave it up so you can come up at the break and take a picture. I'll try to work it into something nicer later on. But this is my census study of the area, Pontiac, Gatineau, the Wright district, and the Irish distribution of it, specifically in 1901. We'll see why I picked 1901 in a minute. By the end of the 19th century, we can see the echoes of both the early settlement of the Irish and also the arrival of the famine refugees. Though many people had moved onwards, their names falling from the valley, the Irish presence had not disappeared, subsumed into either English or French identity, as assumed would happen. In the Gatineau Valley, the results are quite striking. Irish descendants were present in nearly every township, with particularly high concentrations in Kensington and Templeton at 25%, Wright at 26%, Masham at 31%, Wakefield and Denholm at 45%, Hull, excluding the city, at 48%. In Hull City itself, it's only 4%, so we weren't living very much in Hull. Airdley at 49%, Aylwin at 81%, and Low at 85% of the population in 1901, still claiming Irish descent. We can also see the very strong Irish identity remaining in the district of Pontiac next door, with the highest areas in the Gatineau Valley connecting down into a large area extending over to Shawville. It's most likely that many Irish speakers were found in these areas. Right? This is not saying Irish speakers. This is saying in 1901, who was saying, I am Irish. I am not English. I am not French. And this, of course, also doesn't take into account the other side of the river, with the Peter Robinson settlements of the much more fertile land that had been taken there. So there's quite an Irish character to all of this. And I am quite proud to be from this area. We can also see very strong Irish identity remaining in Pontiac. As I said, it's most likely that we would be finding Irish speakers in these areas. The Irish language had not yet disappeared. It had not disappeared. It was still here, even in 1901. The 1901 census, the one that I kind of pin my modern scholarly career around, this is if everybody has a niche, this is my niche, is this one census. It included the question, what is your mother tongue, for the very first time? And it was assumed that lots of people were going to write either Irish or Gaelic, or interchangeably, because as we see from people who spoke it, they say Gaelic as well as Irish. My language is Gaeilge. That's where Gaelic comes from, right? It's more of a political topic in Ireland. So this is the first one that said, you can write your mother tongue. And in the census notes, if somebody says Irish or Gaelic, it's actually okay to write that down this time. That was the first time they said that. And that is, those two are some of the most written responses in Canada for the European population outside of either English or French. It turns out that the Irish were speaking their language. They did continue to speak it. This one line, "What is your mother tongue?" opens up a really rare window into the final echoes of the Irish language in the Irish diaspora in Canada. We're going to take a closer look at some of the final speakers from the area in that census. But when we go into that after the break, we're also going to have to recognize that even the ones that I'm going to put up on the screen, a little tiny handful of them that proudly on the census said their language was Irish, it's just a very small sampling of what once existed if we look at the Irish descent of people here. We know of a poet from Buckingham. I threw, even though they're not consistent with the 1901 census, you can see where Father Dubhghaill and Catherine Holmes and also William Russell were living. This little spread, and honestly, not in the most Irish areas of this settlement either, which is interesting. But we know that there was a poet working in Buckingham in Irish, that was William Russell. We also know of the Irish-speaking community of Mayo nearby that I have been mentioning quotes from Ruth Dunnigan from in St. Malachy. Despite the number of people claiming Irish ethnicity as their mother tongue question, the census rarely actually recorded the Irish language. They said they could record it. That didn't mean they actually did. Most enumerators assumed a default language for the entire area. It was one of the questions most fuddled with in the whole census, I would say, where you would simply say this community is English speaking, write English at the top, and do ditto marks throughout the entire page. It's very rare to have a community that actually records accurately the languages that are spoken in it, unless the enumerator himself spoke the language. What do we see in right and low? We're going to get into that in a minute, but it's a pretty special little area. The Irish language would also only be included if a person knew absolutely no other language, which by this point, if they've been in Canada for 3 generations, they probably spoke English or French as well. That doesn't diminish the fact that your heart and your mind is in Irish. In many regions of Quebec as well, we know this right across Quebec, census takers simply classified all non-French speakers as English, leading to the specific phrase, the English people who don't speak English, to mean Scottish Gaels and Irish Gaels. The census then is not an accurate snapshot in time. What I'm going to be showing you after our little break is who survived through all of these factors to actually pop out at us that there were Irish speakers here in a broad area, celebrating their language and culture. A mere hint of what must have existed across this area a few decades prior, an absolute minimum number, and the last link in an unbroken chain, stretching back to Ireland, to the origin of these people, and to the thousands of years that they had continually spoken this language in the face of all odds and marginalization. So, like I said, I'm going to leave this slide up. We can have our little break. Let's take, I don't know, I feel like a teacher. I shouldn't be setting the times here. Let's take 10, 15 minutes. Make sure I'm all plugged in. Yeah, I'm all plugged in again. All right. Well, I hope everybody is all well fed for us jumping into census studies, because I know that's the most wrapping of topics. So we saw our map here. This is, like I said, me going through the 1901 census, back of the envelope to see Irish identity still existing in this area quite strongly. Why am I not specifically pointing to the language? We'll come across some examples of that, but while I have the map up on the screen, I'll be able to point out to you. We're going to focus mostly on right and low, and that seems to be where the language was prevalent enough, even though, Low and Wakefield, I don't know what I'm talking about. The language actually shows up on the census there, and that's really rare. Like I mentioned, the majority of areas didn't do that. If we look down to some of these other areas in the Pontiac, where we know that identity was extremely strong, something like Clarendon with 71%, even if you get up to Sheen with 83%, none of those census results show Irish. And what they do show instead is English at the top of the page and assuming the language of people without asking it. Maybe they all spoke English, right? I'm not alive in 1901 to go and knock on people's doors and check, but I have a very heavy suspicion from having done these census studies across Canada, especially down in Gagetown, New Brunswick, where we see the same thing happen, that this was probably more reflective of a clerical shortcut than necessarily a linguistic reality. And there are numerous factors into play as to why someone might speak the Irish language, the Scottish Gaelic language, but not actually tell that to a government official. And we'll see that as well. So, like I said, this spun out of control on about Friday as I started out with a simple map and then decided to do more and more in districts. I would have kept on doing more districts in probably the Ottawa Valley, but that'll be for another day. It's just nice to have them on a map because then you can really see who was interacting with who, that these people weren't isolated. They weren't the last speakers with nothing around them, a desert around them. There were other people speaking this language around them. There were other people with this identity around them. All right. Let's have a quote. Ruth Dunnigan, again, of Mayo, quite nearby. In Mayo, Quebec, local oral history affirms that Irish remained the living language right up until the 1920s. 85% of the residents identified as Irish in the 1901 census, but by that census, only 6 people were actually registered as being speakers. Ruth Dunnigan of Mayo remembered, my mother's family and my father's family, they lived close together, and the 2 old ladies used to come and spend the afternoon at our place. And they would always talk in Gaelic, and we got that we could understand every word that they said. All the young ones, they couldn't talk it, but we understood everything they said, and they talked Gaelic to my mother when they wanted to say something the younger ones wouldn't know. They'd tell it to her in Gaelic. They spoke very little English, them old ladies. Now, this is quite a common thing that we see. I saw that in New Brunswick for my census study I did while I lived down there, of the language going behind closed doors, right? It became such a shameful thing to speak this language that if people came into the house, you wouldn't speak it unless you knew that they spoke it. That's common not just in this area, not just in Canada, that's common globally, even in areas of Ireland, that was happening at this point. So in Wakefield Parish, 9 individuals were recorded as still being native speakers of the Irish language. Importantly, among them are 3 specific speakers that I would like to highlight. Bridget Clary, born in 1843, Ellen Morris, born in 1846, and Frances Tenpenny, born in 1846. These 3 are specifically important for what they tell us about this community. These were not immigrants, new immigrants, but they were Quebec-born Irish speakers, raised in homes, and not just homes, but in communities where the language, the Irish language, was deemed useful to their daily life and had been passed on through multiple generations of Canadian-born speakers. Their families had all arrived prior to the famine in Ireland. Most of these individuals were elderly by 1901 and were the last members of their households to claim Irish as a mother tongue. Their children and their grandchildren on the censuses would all be recorded as English speakers. This marks the end of the Irish language transmission in these families. Now, Chelsea, I probably skipped over that in my first part, but Chelsea itself, if we go back in time, just like Mayo, where Mayo was known to have a very strongly Irish character to it, Irish speaking, having around 100 Irish-speaking families at one point, that Chelsea, Quebec, in 1838, Father Brady came to Chelsea, Quebec to minister them, specifically because he spoke the Irish language, because at that point, the settlement of Chelsea was about 100 families speaking nothing but the Irish language. So again, a monolingual settlement in the Irish language. And we see that quite commonly, as we will notice in a moment, but where the Irish speakers who continued to transmit this language over generations tended to not be the famine speakers. The famine speakers holding that tragedy and that trauma distanced themselves from the language through necessity. And these communities that had been transmitting the language, in some cases in Canada since the 1700s, were all lost around the same time. That wave of shame and trauma that the famine induced globally in the Irish language seemed to take a language that was fairly stable in Canada and had been transmitted in the hearts and minds of people and swamped it in a tragedy that caused it to be lost. Lost to the point where then we're told it never existed in Canada and speakers arrived only speaking English. The most surprising data emerges from Low, where 30 Irish speakers were recorded in 1901. Of these, only 4 were Catholic. That should set off a bomb in the mind of anyone who does Irish studies. The remainder were Protestant, mainly descended from Irish immigrants who had arrived in the early 19th century. Again, pre-famine. This finding challenges long-held assumptions that Irish was only preserved by Catholics or nationalists, while 20th century language revival movements increasingly linked Irish with Catholic identity in Ireland and anti-colonial politics in Canada. Irish survived across religious lines in rural Protestant homes as much as in Catholic ones. One such family was the Stuarts. Samuel Stuart, born in Quebec in 1857, appears in the census alongside his 5 children, all recorded with Irish as their mother tongue, Irish as their nationality. Them coming from the north of Ireland, likely Antrim, I would assume they might have, if we go back to the 16 or 1700s, possibly have been Scottish Gaelic planters during the plantation of Ulster. One under-recognized element of the plantation of Ulster was they didn't just take English speakers, they also took Scottish Gaelic speakers. And that failed miserably because the Scottish Gaelic speakers just changed their accent a little bit, and now they're Irish Gaelic speakers, and they just melded with the community. So I assume that they might have been part of that. His father, John Stuart, had emigrated from Ireland around the time of the Napoleonic Wars. The Stuarts, Protestant farmers in Low, passed Irish down through at least 3 generations in Canada. Samuel's son, Robert, born in 1880, is the last known native Irish speaker in this Gatineau Valley that I've been able to recognize from the census studies so far, for whom we have that documentation. Though it's almost certain, that if Irish survived in Low, it likely persisted in all those other really, really green areas that I had on the map there, all those neighboring areas that they could have cross-communicated with. Aylwin, for instance, was 80% Irish by population. The census forms uniformly claim that all of the residents were native French speakers, even the ones who had Irish as their nationality, which likely points more to a clerical shortcut than to any linguistic reality on the ground in these areas. For comparison, by the 1931 census, we did have a Gaelic-speaking MP at that point speak out against the census, saying that of Vancouver's estimated 10,000 Gaelic speakers, only 834 of them actually showed up in the census. For Toronto, only 230 of Toronto's estimated 20,000 Gaelic speakers showed up. Now that's Scottish Gaelic and Irish Gaelic together. So we can see that even if you spoke the language, this language that the government for generations had tried to take out of your mouth, you might not let them know that you still spoke it. What would be the benefit to you? In the Gatineau Valley, the 1901 census opens a brief little window into the Irish language's local survival in these hills and valleys, but it vanishes again in subsequent census records. After that, we go back to it just being a page of English or French. I will also highlight that its survival among Protestants is radical, right? For anyone who's from Ireland, we know that. We have Irish speakers in the group here today. That's more of a modern invention than anything. Numerous communities across Canada, when I was going through my studies and being told I couldn't pursue this as a master's project because I wouldn't find anything, because the majority of people who came to Canada were Protestant. What I have found subsequently in my research is the majority of communities that continued to speak the Irish language in Canada were Protestant communities. One notable example, the Gagetown Gaeltacht in Gagetown, New Brunswick, where the members who were in the census as being Irish speakers were members of the Orange Lodge and had their names strucken from the census, and the power that they held through the Orange Lodge, including the Grand Master, Grand Wizard, whatever they called them, of the Orange Lodge, had gone back to personally correct his census result to say, no, I speak the Irish language. I'm currently doing another study for a community closer to Sarnia. Again, I've done these census studies for years and years, and I'm still shocked by the linguistic reality in Canada. A community, again, settled by this massive people in the 1820s, pre-famine, that was uniformly Protestant Irish speakers. By the 1901 census, they would have formed about 20% of the population. And the community didn't even have a Catholic church. There were no Catholics in the community. There was a single Catholic living on the outskirts of the community, and I believe they might have come from Germany or the Netherlands. All of the Irish in that community were Protestant and had spoken the Irish language for generations in Canada proudly as Protestant Irish speakers. Again, something we are told should not happen. But why might the language have declined? I've made a pretty good case that it was all over the place. You couldn't shake a tree, you wouldn't have an Irish speaker fall out of it. Why don't we all still speak this language? If so many Irish arrived speaking only the Irish language, the decline of Irish in the Gatineau Valley mirrors the broader story of the language loss across the Irish diaspora globally. When we look at New Zealand, Australia, all these places that the Irish were sent. Several forces converged to end its transmission. It's quite a naughty little topic. No institutional support. The Irish was excluded from schools, courts. Formal religion. If you were Catholic, you were probably going to Latin Mass. If you were Protestant, Anglican specifically, probably more English Mass. There was no room for Irish in those. There are noted examples from the Ottawa Valley where the German language thrived, and that was because of governmental support for German language primary schools. There were no such supports for Irish language primary schools. Cultural stigma in both Ireland and Canada, Irish was widely associated with poverty, backwardness, and stupidity. To be an Irish speaker was to be a relic of the past. And pressure to assimilate. English or French became the default languages for economic survival and for inter-community cohesion. Now, people can keep more than one language. There's a lot of bilingual people in the audience today. You can keep two languages just fine. So it is more of, we can see that the languages were kept within the Canadian context by people who weren't necessarily monolingual speakers, but the transmission of the language, I think, falls much more into that shame category of why you would not teach it to your children. There are many noted examples of, obviously, the national school system in Ireland and Canada used the same textbooks because the Irish textbooks were thought to fit the Canadian population better because we had such an Irish character to us. And this was an entire overlaying of Irish history with English colonial history, British history. There are no Irish kings, there are no Irish queens or culture named in any of those school books. And repression of the language through that, where children would be corporally punished if they spoke any of the Celtic languages, as we saw with minoritized languages around the world, having it taken from the mouths of children through violence. But specifically then, many examples where it was the parents that were causing the violence, where the parents would beat their children if they heard them speaking this language because they wanted their children to move into the modern world. Quite tragic. Old sectarian divisions between Irish Catholics and Protestants reignited in the Canadian context. All these topics are so broad I can't go into them in any massive detail, unfortunately. Where British authorities largely sided with Anglo-Irish Orangemen. So Irish Catholics often were excluded from high office. There is a government publication from about the 1870s that goes through Quebec and Ontario stating every single judge, every single holder of a public office, every single clerical position within the government to show how many Irish Catholics there were, and there were basically none. Any anti-Catholic violence was routinely ignored by the authorities. The Irish were also in steep competition with the French lumbermen. We had come in to horn in on their territory a little bit there with the lumbering, culminating in the bloody Shiners' War that we all know about, the stories from this area of them coming into conflict, these two Catholic populations coming into conflict. Acts of violence on both sides. This was not a right versus wrong. And one of the very interesting effects of this lumbering violence and the Shiners' War was that French Catholics began to preferentially vote for English Protestants, if they had to, when necessary, in order to prevent Irish Catholics from being elected into any positions of power. I often point to the Fenian raids as being a strong source of yet another factor that subsumed these people. We have the trauma of the famine. We have the general Canadian culture still being part of the British Empire and being quite aggressive towards the Celtic cultures. And then we have the Fenian raids, adding another little dlí volig on the top knot on top. The Fenian raids, armed incursions by American nationalists, Irish American nationalists, aimed at pressuring Britain to free Ireland. The idea was to conquer Canada, hold it for ransom so that Britain would release Ireland from bondage. This further poisoned public opinion against the Gaelic Irish. We can see one quote from the Globe in Toronto, 1856. An Irish priest is not and cannot be loyal to our queen, our empire, or our people. He has no part or lot with us. He has no interest in us. He is an alien, though born within the bounds. His oath of fealty is a kiss of Judas. So you can imagine why you might hide your culture if it is associated with these movements. Though the Fenians acted independently, their actions cast suspicion on all Irish communities in Canada. In Quebec, cries of fainéant were used to stigmatize the Irish Catholics, playing on the similarity to the word lazy. The fallout was severe. The government suspended habeas corpus for anyone suspected of supporting Irish freedom, and sweeping legal measures that branded the Catholic Irish as disloyal Canadians. A pamphlet that was produced complaining about this by O'Hanley in 1872 states, "The whole proceeding was solely directed against the Irish Catholics of Canada, for it could avail nothing against foreigners. It was determined to bring us into disrepute, to declare by extraordinary legislation that we were all disloyal, and conspiring with strangers against the peace and institutions of our adopted country." Fear took hold. Some Irish Canadians Anglicized their names or concealed their heritage to avoid harassment. This occurred in my own family. My grandmother's family, on my mother's side, Tamworth, Ontario, that's where we have the Gaeltacht site now, quite appropriately, that their family had settled in Canada many generations before. Protestants, speaking Irish most likely, because they came from Cork, Kerry, and were O'Sullivanes, one of the most ancient royal septs in Ireland. And around this time of the Fenian raids, they uniformly, within one census, changed all of the family members' names from O'Sullivan to Selman, an Anglo-Saxon name very ironically meaning a fortunate man. And they hid that they were Irish. How many Irish people are actually in Canada? Current statistics say around 20% of Canadians can claim Irish descent. It's probably significantly higher than that, and people just don't know. My grandmother, until the day she died, was adamant that she was not a dirty Irish person, that her family were proud Anglo-Saxons, and that any reason why when they showed up in Canada and wrote O'Sullivan instead of Selman was probably because they must have been drunk for the census taker. So there was still that entire rejection of the Irish identity as being something lesser and as being something dirty. Cultural silence and denying your ancestry became a form of survival for the Gaelic Irish. In this climate, the Irish language was not just forgotten, it was deliberately smothered. What had once been a lifeline between neighbors, generations, continents, became a liability to the survival of your family. Beneath these practical factors lay a deeper psychic wound, the legacy of the colonization of Ireland. Many Irish emigrants fled a homeland where their language had been criminalized, ridiculed, and blamed for all of their suffering. In Canada, the promise of a new life came with an unspoken condition: silence. To be Irish increasingly meant to speak English. Linguist Otto Jefferson wrote in 1905, similar to when our study's happening, the Celt would have to learn the language of his masters and learn it well. He could not think of addressing his superiors in his own unintelligible gibberish. The majority of Canadian-born Irish speakers in 1901 had been in Canada for generations, arriving in the 1820s. But both they and the famine Irish stopped passing on Irish at about the same time. It seems the influx of this large mass of famine refugees and the deep trauma that they had experienced on their way to Canada may have swamped what until then had been an intergenerational language in Canada. Most definitely, the national school system used corporal punishment against Irish and Scottish Gaelic speakers. This happened, like I said, minoritized languages around the world caused global hurt by these policies. Those who still carried the language did so quietly, sometimes with pride, more often with shame. For those who refused or still maintained their unique culture and language to be the greatest legacy of their ancestors, it seems that the government authorities simply chose to take away with a pen what they had refused to give up through all hardship. As we can see, this should be quite affecting for anyone who holds an Irish identity. This is an example that I found specifically from the New Brunswick Gagetown census, but this has been recorded as happening across Canada for minoritized languages, the overwriting of an identity to say English instead. And so the final voices faded. Cultural memory persisted, but only a handful of words now passed from parent to child. If you're wondering about the stick, Eric will be lovely to explain the whole story about this being one of the words that survived. How is this brought down in your dialect? Brala, which is a nice stick for beating a child with. Or cattle. Yeah, it's a good beating stick. It's a good stick for moving something to where it doesn't want to go. These are the type of words, though, that there isn't an easy translation for. You can't fill the void in your mind when a language is taken away. There are gaps. And even if you don't have the words anymore, you feel those gaps where those words used to live. One of the words that I really like is it's in my area down near Russell as well, but it's also from up this area and also in the Ottawa Valley. It tends to be the similar words that you find. So when I did some dialectical studies in Newfoundland as well, it tends to be those same handful of words, brosna, that comes up, or one word that comes across from all of them is gruuma, right? So it's what I would say it's a groomy day, but that's me being down in Russell and having more of a Scottish Gaelic bent to it. It's a day that's very gloomy and bleak and overcast and a bad day for going out fishing, right? And you can't say that with one word in English. You need that Irish word, you need that Scottish Gaelic word, and even when that word is gone, you still feel that loss of that word. Cultural memory persisted, but only a handful of words now passed from parent to child, having melded into the local English dialect. Irish had ceased to be a language of everyday life. The final collapse of it was quiet and unnoticed. As Eamon McKee noted, he's our former ambassador there, Ireland too forgot this situation. The traumatic collapse of Irish due to the famine, as we saw from the workshop, where it went from still the majority of people speaking it to the present situation where 1% speak it as their daily language. The traumatic collapse of Irish due to the famine, the refocusing of emigration to the US afterwards, and the fight for Ireland's release from the British Empire, of which Canada was a part, we still have a king, shattered any memory of the deeper connections between Ireland and Canada that had been formed. Yet echoes endured. Though Irish ceased to be the language of daily life for these people, it lived on in fragments, songs, prayers, proverbs passed down in oral tradition. In 1957, I said Canadian, but she's American. American folklore is the Yiddish folk. Perhaps not. Perhaps she is Canadian. I can't remember. I'd have to check my sources now. With the support of the Smithsonian Institution, sought out Irish cultural memory in the lumber camps and villages of the Ottawa Valley. She met O.J. Abbott. Himself, he was from England, but he came over as a young boy, and he had learned songs, over 100 songs, from the lumbermen, who at that point were third or more generation Irish. So this was not something they had gotten on a record and played for themselves until they learned it. This was something that had crossed the ocean in the mouths of their ancestors. She sought out O.J. Abbott, who had learned these songs. Many of them followed the traditional sean-nós patterns, including the spoken final line, which is a really strong hallmark of Irish singing, traditional sean-nós singing. A lot of dance, a lot of tunes. If ever I play a tune, I'm a piper, and if ever I play a tune, my grandfather would always say, that's not an Irish tune, that's an Ontario tune, that's an old tune, we invented that. You'll find a lot of overlap between rural Anglo tunes, dancing, singing, and what actually is Irish. One of these songs, which I have up on the screen there, on Crushkin Lawn, the full little jug, O.J. Abbott had learned from Owen McCann of Hull, carried both joy and sorrow in the song of it. The song is a fragment, a reminder of a time when the Irish language had found a home in the Gatineau Valley. The earliest settlers had raised Irish-speaking children, and later the most desperate had found refuge from the horrors of the famine. They brought their language to the valley, and in it they created poetry and song, as we saw. These collecting efforts, however, came too late, and the vast majority of songs and stories of the Gaelic Irish that had lived in their mouths and minds had been lost with the language. Let's see if we can hear him sing this, maybe. Perhaps not. No, it's going to pull up the internet. I'll just sing it for you. Sure. Gramochri mochroshkin slant the gal movornin, herin movornin, lan. Gramochri mochroshkin slant the gal movornin, hergen magaligen lan. Very simple little tune, isn't it? But think of the journey that song went on to survive. And you can look it up. That's a Smithsonian recording of the songs of the Ottawa Valley lumber camps. So you can hear him sing that. The survival of the Irish in the Gatineau Valley into the early 20th century reminds us that minority languages, minoritized languages, do not simply vanish in the face of hardship. They endure when they are loved and when they are passed on in the hearts and minds of people. These stories invite us to reconsider the dominant narrative of the Irish language, far from being the predestined outcome for an insufficient lesser language only suited to the fringe of Western Ireland, farms and fishing boats. The lives of Catherine Holmes, Father Dubhghaill, and others show us that Irish was loved in the Gatineau Valley and actively transmitted across generations of speakers, often against great odds. Now, if you're interested in exploring more about the speakers mentioned today, including the full catalogue of Father Dubhghaill's writings, which I have painstakingly transcribed and updated and put into English as well, I have made all of these publicly accessible for free through www.gaeliga.ca. That's just the name of the Irish language.ca. You can see it in very fancy print at the bottom or on my business cards over there. That's part of that exhibit that I mentioned, this collecting of Irish material from across Canada in the face of being told that we didn't exist as a people in Canada. The only people who came were the people who had already lost their language. The exhibit catalogs people who brought manuscripts with them and finished their handwritten, illuminated manuscripts here in Canada, in St. Malachy, of all places, having beautiful, continuing this tradition of the Irish all the way from the 700s of illuminating manuscripts. But some interesting things, such as the ring that's on the screen, that's from the Parks Canada collection. That was pretty hard for me to, it's up near, over top of Breed's head, over the right-hand side there, you'll see a claddagh ring. And that claddagh ring comes from one of the fur trading posts of the Northwest Company in northern Alberta and dates from the 1780s. Now, the claddagh ring had only been thought of, conceived in the claddagh communities about the 1760s or 1770s. So it was most likely somebody from this small Gaelic village that still had an elected king that wore this ring and brought it with him across to this fur trading outpost in the north of Ontario, or north of Alberta. Whoever this was is lost to us. But these are the type of things that I've tried to gather back together. You'll see my lovely daughter's face on there as well, because she fits in this story. She is one of the Irish speakers of Canada now. This is an ongoing and unbroken tradition. We had a little break for a while. It slumbered, but it didn't go away. So that's the nonprofit that I run for Teaching Irish. If anyone is feeling especially inspired, we do run immersion camps virtually, in person. I run them mostly at cost. I'm not looking to make a profit from any of these. We are a nonprofit. I'm looking at getting Irish back into the mouths of people who want to speak it. As we reflect on the story of the Irish in the Gatineau Valley, we must also confront the deeper colonial structures in which this story took place. In Canada, from their beginnings as an unwanted, repressed, and colonized underclass within the British Empire, the Gaelic Irish were able to form communities and see economic prosperity, something that had been specifically excluded from them in Ireland. But the very spaces where the Irish found a future and in which their language was spoken exist within the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Nation. The forest that gave timber to John Egan's empire, the lands he offered to dispossessed Irish at 50 cents an acre, were not empty. They have been occupied, tended, and understood by generations of the land's first people. To honor the story of the Irish language survival here means acknowledging the wider structures of violence and loss that made that survival possible, while perpetuating it for others. The Irish found in Canada what had been denied to them in Ireland: land, freedom, and futures, but that was gained at the expense of others. So let us return at last to the story that we began with. The children of Lear, flying in sorrow across centuries of exile, their voices the only reminder of who they once truly were. They endured not by returning home, but by carrying home with them, in memory, in music, and in their hearts. So too did the Irish who came to Canada, and so too did Father Dubhghaill, the poet-priest from Mayo, the harsh lands where the swan's legs had frozen to the rocks, who served in Wakefield in the shadow of the Great Famine. In one of his poems, Is Trua gan Vishimale, he gave voice to a longing so many Irish exiles would have recognized: to return to the rivers and springs of Ireland, if not in body then in soul, and to remember the land that he had lost, but which he too still held in his heart. Is trua gan Vishimale do glúisinshe bhaile, a snáb seall uisce har luasca na dán. Bogón mo shriel har muir, mar janolin ní leir, le chonún na herin go riano mo vrin. De ming heen vergasse, naar weer fos a jasse, is koning zijn noches mo hinters mo geil. Eg omloe gach sruche, as eg onle mo chruche, I veer hebreha swit, fog tieren and gail. It is a pity I am not a swan. I would travel home, swimming on phantom wings over the rolling waves. Severe would be my journey over the sea, as Fionnuala, daughter of Lear, beloved hero of Ireland that traces my dreams. If I myself was under gasa, we know that word from my lecture, taboo, on the grass not to stand, I would live in the district of my ancestors and relations, traveling along every stream and washing my form in the true, sweet springs throughout the land of the Gaels. Is hiúlanse mar fionvar, gach áwan is gach inver, I gríoch even éiren, ag machna scéil, ag tríl sias go maul moch, go hoogter a seanna loch, koort fe gach rief rú fe riocht ag sruch gael. Vein lo go dúv deoroch, mar chlársig chin óroch, ag tú slecht éiren fe grú go síléin, go me Saxon ille, go sirse chlawn ville, is ó rís, is ó chéin vrid, go skil he me hen. I would walk as Finnever, the king of the fairies of Connacht, every stream and inlet in the beautiful land of Ireland, reflecting upon their tale, going down early and slow to the top of the old lake, visiting every kingly hostel and kingdom of the flowing Gaels. I would be with them dark and sad as a gentle-sounding harp, solemnly proclaiming the generations of Ireland under the Druids and sages. May the Saxons all decline, and freedom for the Gaels, and from hatred and long bondage may I myself be released. Gura míle maith agaibh. May you all have 1,000 kindnesses.
Gurav Mahagut, Dónall. Thank you, everybody, for choosing to come here today on such a beautiful sunny day. I just wanted to make a mention that Dónall has written an article that is, at least one article in, I think, volume 45 of Up the Gatineau called The Goyles. I just learned that's of the Gatineau Valley, not the Gaels, the Goyles. It's so wonderful, the work that you're doing with preserving language. I love languages, and I could listen to you read poetry all day long, but I thought maybe I'd just ask if there's anyone out here who has any questions. If if we have questions, we'll try and keep it really short for today because it is lovely. And Dónall has a long drive home, and we had a break, and it wasn't a scheduled break. So if there are any questions, I will come with the microphone. The reason I'll come. You don't have to be afraid of this, but we do these proceedings. These presentations are being recorded so that we can post them on the Gatineau Valley Historical Society website, so that folks who couldn't make it can enjoy the presentations. So, are there any questions out there? Yeah.
Gurv Magad Asangaint. Takesh Jagam Fui. I was wondering if you. Gurmaga. Tamek Folum. I'm learning. Yeah. Gurmaga. So I was wondering, I know the research is still preliminary, but I was wondering if you had any theories about why the survival of the language was so strong amongst the Protestant settlers and even within the Orange Order.
So I've been doing this research for a while, and that's a very good question. We presented at it up at the University of Derry, and that was terrifying. To stand in Derry and tell people that it was the Protestants that were speaking it, including people of the Grand Order. But it seems like they didn't face the institutional shame that the Gaelic Irish did, that the Catholic Irish did, that they had the power in society, in Canadian colonial society, just like they did in Ireland, to be able to take over areas of high office and to make it that it could be okay. So for my example of, I'm doing the one community, but I haven't finished that for up near Sarnia, but for the communities in New Brunswick, that was extremely high transmission of it. There were people who had very high stations in life. There were judges and clerks and teachers, the owner of the general store, the operator of the ferry. And a lot of those positions in society, if you were a Catholic Irish, even in Canada, you would have been excluded from those. So they didn't have the mobility within society to almost have the privilege of keeping their language. The Catholic Irish did. But that the Protestant Irish did seem to, and they didn't at that point connect it like we do in a modern period into it being that. It was only then after really the Fenian raids in Canada and the Irish nationalism and the cultural revival of the 1890s stretching up to the fight for freedom in Ireland, that it really became connected to, you are a Catholic, therefore you speak Irish, you are a Protestant, therefore you speak English. Because if we look at Douglas Hyde, the leader of the Cultural Revolution in Ireland, he was a Protestant. He was the son of an Anglican minister, right? So it became much more hard set in the modern period than I think people who emigrated in the 1820s, they wouldn't have had that concept. I am Irish, therefore I speak Irish, as opposed to it being kind of this modern split along nationalist lines, that if you speak Irish, you are against the British occupation of Ireland. Yeah.
Ansamil Gurmaga.
Oh, it warms my heart that we have so many Irish speakers in the crowd today. It's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Not so much a question, but more a pitch. Some of you may know me, see me around from time to time. So I guess I could stand up. My name is Eric Lashardy. I'm related to the Dailies, the homes that everybody from up around here. Family came 1842. That's on my dad's side. On my mother's side, French and Anishinaabe through the Chaussee and so on. Very mixed bag. And I wanted to communicate that as of like last year and a bit before that, I've kind of started an aspirational kind of trying to get people to buy in here for what is tentatively called right now the Coria Gaelic and the Gatineau, so like the Council of Gatineau Valley Irish, the vast majority of the people here, right? To ensure that our culture here for the past 7-8 generations does not get erased or disappear, and that we're able to kind of hold on to that. And so through that, I have some little cards here. I've got some paperwork that's kind of going around, which I would like to kind of open that invitation. So feel free to email, try and get a few more things language-wise and stuff starting here too. And furthermore, like to just kind of collect our heritage. I have some of my grandmother on the Derby sides diaries that are very informative there as well. I'm sure a lot of you have something in your attic that might be of interest. So thank you very much. And yeah, I'll pass some cards around later. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'll just make the comment that if anyone is feeling very inspired, languages, we are absolutely privileged, despite our history with the Irish language, that it still exists and it still lives. And if anybody is interested in this topic, my father does not speak Irish. My grandfather did not speak Irish, right? They were all born in Canada. And I have spoken it for half of my life. It informs your view, it informs your compassion and understanding towards others to retake your own language. And I would recommend that if anyone is even minutely interested, try learn a couple words. Try just opening that little crack again. As I was saying to people over there, the Irish language lives in its children and in its descendants, that this is a language that the salt has been thrown on the earth for generations, telling us that it should die and has died. And even now I get that comment a lot. At Irish embassy events, I've been told that I'm damaging my children. I am told that there is absolutely no purpose for the Irish language in the modern world. And I heavily disagree with that. If you allow that little crack through, if you are of Irish descent, and even if you're not of Irish descent and you are interested in this topic, just learn a couple words and see where that takes you. Give it that space in your life to grow that little bit, and you will find that it opens so many doors, and there are so many languages around the world, colonized languages, that do not have speakers anymore. I mean, we don't even have to look that far from Ireland to see that with Cornish and Manx, that those are now languages that have had to be recreated so that they can live again. But with the Irish language, we still have people. My dialect has 700 daily speakers, and it's one of the strongest dialects in Ireland right now. But those 700 speakers in that community have spoken that since before the Iron Age in an unbroken chain, and I would like to reforge my link into that chain for my children going forward. So it's something, consider that. That Irish identity, I find a lot of Irish Canadians are very proud to be Irish Canadian, but they have a very tenuous idea of what that necessarily means. And even opening a little window into what the Irish language is will open stories and songs and words and proverbs and a beauty into your life that you might not have even recognized was missing. So that's my little pitch for my language.
That's a great pitch. Thank you so much. I wanted to thank Della LaCharity for organizing today's event. Thank you, Della. And I know that Louise Schwartz brought some of her famous baking here today, so we did really well that way. The next event coming up for the Gatineau Valley Historical Society is on June 14th. It's the launch of the volume 51 of Up the Gatineau, and Brian Doyle will be doing a reading at that event. There will be live music from the Fieldville String Band. We have some folks who penned articles here in the room. Martin Lamontagne is here. Don Keeley, has he gone? No, he's there. And Gilbert White Duck, along with Toby Sangster, wrote something, and I wrote a little something on Fieldville, which I couldn't find anything on Fieldville. So there are a number of stories in this particular edition that speak about the Irish immigrants to this area in particular. So it might be fun. That will be happening at La Fab in Chelsea in the afternoon. I don't know a time. We'll let you know. I'd like to ask Della to come up I'd like to ask Gilbert to come up. I'm going to ask both of them to come up. I'm learning as we go.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to take a moment to say Kichimigwach for having taken the time in the 2 sessions. For me, it was, and maybe for everyone else, I assume engaging, enriching, educational. I was thinking of the 3 E's as I leave here with a greater understanding, and I think inspirational. It's inspirational to have that understanding, and I'm sure everyone else, based on what they had. And so from the bottom of my heart, and certainly the Historical Society, thank you for the time that you took out and the way you present. Very engaging, it comes from a place of goodness. So thank you very much. And I want to thank all of you, certainly for coming out on a beautiful Saturday afternoon. And like it was mentioned, there are other presentations, hopefully this fall, on other topics. Please come. A lot of learning that can take place. If you can join the Historical Society, of course, that's even better. The more participants we have, the more. Also, if you have any suggestions of topics maybe that could be presented, that's another important part of that. But before we close, I would call upon Della. I really need to say it. I mean, Della has been really the key person behind coordinating all of this. There's a team, of course, all the time. It's never done by one person, but she does these events in such a beautiful way, such an organized way. We owe her a whole lot. She sits on the Historical Society and has been a really, really solid leader, taking her time to make sure these things work out well. So miigwech Della. And Della would like to present a gift to Dónall.
So I have 2 bottles. One is Golden Glow pickles. The other one is beets that I made. It's a tradition. Our grandmother who lived with us and our mother, we lived on a farm in Venosta, and we didn't buy much at the store. I'm not that old, but most stuff was, from the garden, from the ground, the cattle, the pigs, the chickens, whatever. So it's something my sisters and I have continued to do every fall. We make our pickles. And also have a bottle of maple syrup that my nephew from Denholm, which isn't far, just recently made with his family.
Wow.
So I'd like to present it to you. Thank you so much for answering our call, not once, but twice in just a couple of weeks. Answering all my zillion of questions and sharing information. It's been a privilege.
Well, thank you so much. Put 'em on.
Miigwech, everyone, and have a beautiful remainder of a Saturday and a weekend. Miigwech.
Thank you.